Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's seminar. I would like to thank IOP Fellow Laura Washington for hosting us today. Coming to the IOP, Laura Washington brings more than 2 award-winning decades of experience as a nonprofit professional and multimedia journalist. Today, she will lead us in a discussion of this month's upcoming mayoral race. We are absolutely thrilled today to welcome mayoral candidate Amara Enyia to discuss her vision for Chicago's future. She brings to the race years of experience as a consultant, education policy expert, and community organizer. I would like to remind everybody that today's seminar is on the record, which means that you are free to take photos and videos. Students will also have the opportunity to ask brief questions towards the end of today's discussion. We have a great discussion ahead of us, and I hope that you are as excited as we are to get started.
Thank you. Thank you, Drew. Thanks for all of you for being here. Nice crowd today. And you've gotten your lunch, so you're raring to go. The important stuff, right? Thank you, Amara, for doing this. I know we were just talking, college campuses are not unfamiliar to you. You've been doing a lot of work around college campuses, especially recently with your Get Out the Vote effort. Tell me, what is that like? What is your strategy around the youth vote right now? Because this is the audience.
Yes. So it's definitely been one of the more exciting aspects of our campaign. We know that we have a lot of appeal to younger voters, to millennials, and that college campuses are great places to organize and to spread the word about the election. So our strategy has been just rallying people on their campuses. We have ambassadors embedded on their campuses, and they help to spread the word about the campaign, to register people to vote, and then we actually have buses that will take people from where they're located on their campus to the nearest polling place. So we have a really aggressive strategy. We even have students that are embedded outside of Chicago, so we know we've got a large population of Chicago residents who are at Urbana-Champaign, who are at Southern Illinois University, and we wanted them to be able to mail in their ballots because they still have their residency in Chicago. So we have an effort around that as well for students who are outside of the city limits but are still registered to vote in Chicago.
And what specifically are you doing on this campus, on the University of Chicago?
So we've actually been here a couple of times. We did a pull-up last in the fall, and that was just talking about the campaign. It was closer to the beginning when we first started, encouraging people to register to vote, hearing the issues. So it was a good way of hearing what are the key issues that students in particular are concerned about. And then just having volunteers. We've gotten many students who come from UFC who are part of our policy team, who are helping us to draft policy, who are helping us to engage volunteers. So it's been a really good receptacle for individuals who've been wanting to get more involved in electoral politics, and why not in a mayoral campaign.
And what I've heard is this campus is particularly active around voter registration. Has a pretty high percent. What's the percentage of? 80% of students here are registered. So you got some good fertile ground to work with here. So there's been a lot. We're near the end. We're rounding the bend. there are a lot of candidates running. There's been a lot of polling done. You've not have been near the top of most of that polling. You haven't necessarily gotten the visibility that some of the other candidates have gotten in the media with the debates because of the way the media and the legacy politics works. So. But the good news for you probably is that there's a lot of undecided voters out there. The latest polls I've seen is between 20 and 25% of undecided voters.
Sure.
So what are you going to do to bring if you bring in a lot of those folks, no matter where you are in the polls, with this kind of a fragmented race, you could win. So what's your strategy? What's your message to those voters right now?
Well, so our message it's pretty much the same message that we've had from the beginning of the campaign. We did see a significant jump in our positioning in the polls down to, or up to rather, I would say around fourth place out of all of the candidates, which is huge considering where we started, considering the fact that we did not have the Democratic Party machinery. We didn't have millions of dollars or decades of political favors that we could have called in, and to still be in fourth place according to polls that we didn't commission is a huge leap for us, and it shows it speaks very highly of the work that we've been able to do to get our message out in spite of not having those advantages. Our message really resonates with people across the city. We believe that a lot of the concern that people have is they simply want change. They are tired of the status quo. They do not want the same establishment. They're looking for something different that is authentic and that speaks to the issues that they care about. And so as we've gone around the city, what we're hearing is folks are not really being attracted by the candidates that come out of the establishment because it represents the same mold. And we're just in an era where people are wanting something different. And it's not just Chicago, it's actually happening across the country. And our campaign happens to be unique in that it really speaks to average Chicagoans. We are committed to lifting up the voice of average Chicagoans and the issues that we face, and it resonates with them. So we have, our supporters are very strong supporters, and that's a good thing. And for the undecideds, it's just simply giving them a place to land where they can see themselves in the campaign that we're talking about and in the future that we're describing for the city. So we think our opportunity is with that percentage of undecided voters.
And why do you think there are so many, there's such a large number of undecided voters? What do you, in terms of when you talk to folks, what are you hearing and what's your view on that?
I think it is, one is just the number of candidates. I mean, there's just a lot of candidates. Even as a candidate, it's a lot of candidates.
14! 14, yes.
So it's hard to keep track and to really have the distinction between who these individuals are and where they come from. So I think that's a factor. Also, we are positioned in this unique opportunity where, as a city, we do have a chance to move significantly away from everything that we've done before, but that's also a scary prospect for some people. So there's the comfort of what we all know, right? So the status quo, there's a certain comfort in the devil you know, if you will, versus the risk of voting for a candidate that is not like all of the other mayors that we've had. And I think that that gives people pause. Generally, we know that they are saying the city needs to move in a different direction, but there's still, that's the first step, but there's still the second step to say, and this is who I will vote for that will move the city in the direction I think it needs to go. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where that pool of undecided voters is right now. They know that we need something different, but it's, can we get over maybe the apprehension or the risk of voting for a candidate that is so drastically different from what we've been used to?
And that candidate is you, of course.
Certainly.
You're drastically different, how both personally and professionally, and in terms of what your agenda. You said people want change. What does change look like for you, and what's so different about you?
Yes.
What makes you outside the box compared with all the other candidates?
Yes. So I mean, I look a little bit different from our last mayors, just a little bit different. But I think it is, so a background, obviously I've not been in elected office before. I'm someone who's worked in government, so I've worked in government and city government. I've also worked in the nonprofit sector, but I'm also an organizer, and I've always been an organizer, even before coming back to Chicago after school, and fundamentally believe that public policy should emanate from the bottom up, and that public policy should be informed by the lived experiences of the people of this city. And for such a long time, we've had this top-down approach to policymaking, and we've had leadership that does not necessarily reflect either the experiences or the values of so many people in Chicago. And so I come from a place of a lot of the issues that we talk about, they're not theoretical to me. So when we talk about affordability in Chicago, when we talk about economic justice, when we talk about what it means to try to figure out what kind of school to get into, or people making tough decisions between paying a ticket and paying for their medicine, those are actual experiences that are very close to my experience and that reflect the experiences of so many people who are just trying to make it from day to day in Chicago. And our campaign has always been one that is aimed at using my experience as a way to lift up the voices and the experiences of so many other Chicagoans who have been pushing for change across the board. And I think that is what makes it different. It's what makes it attractive. And also because we're just committed to actually getting out and talking to people. So as organizers, we just believe that you go out into neighborhoods and you talk to people and you meet them where they are. And that is how our policy stances have been informed. It's been going into neighborhoods, talking to people, and then using our campaign as a way to reflect back what they've shared with us.
Can you give me a couple examples of policy positions that you are taking, things that you are committed to doing as mayor that have come out of this lived experience analysis, that have come out of talking to people?
Certainly. So one of the things that we released early this year was our economic justice platform, and it tackles the city's practice of using fines and fees in a way that is punitive and we believe that the city has to switch its philosophy with how we collect money that's owed in a way that's productive and progressive. And so what that means is instead of having a flat rate for these tickets, they actually should be progressively structured to take into account a person's income, their ability to pay. Because, for example, a $100 ticket for someone who makes $20,000 a year is a lot different to someone who makes $200,000 a year. But the ticketing structure does not reflect that. So we're advocating for a progressive structure for these tickets and fines and fees.
Now,
We also
hold for a minute. Why isn't that discriminatory? It's the same offense. I didn't, you know, I let the meter run too long. I parked in an illegal parking space. Why, if I'm making $50,000 a year, should I have to pay more than someone who's making $20,000 a year? Is that discriminatory?
Yeah, well, you're not actually paying more. It's just the way that the ticket is structured is based on your income to pay. So if you make $20,000 and you can only pay $10 a month for 10 months or however much
so you're still paying the same ticket, but you get more time to pay it essentially.
Precisely.
And that's coming out of what did you hear from voters that caused you to respond in that way? Is it causing enough hardship?
It certainly is.
To make a difference in people's lives?
It certainly is. So we have, over the last several years, a cottage industry has developed because people have been filing for bankruptcy because of parking tickets and red light camera tickets that they've gotten from the city. And so it is negatively affecting them in the present and into the future. And so you have a situation where people are deciding that they need to file for bankruptcy so that they can keep their vehicle. That's very problematic. We also had a situation where in the analysis of where tickets are given, we find that there's a disparate impact on certain communities because they have a higher percentage of red light cameras in their neighborhood or speed cameras in their neighborhood. Also, if you look at how communities are policed, where they have much more police presence, they're more liable to get tickets, for example, in Austin for riding your bike on the sidewalk, more so than if you lived in Lincoln Park or along that Milwaukee Avenue corridor. And so there is a disparate impact where we're going to be hit harder for those tickets than individuals in other, and in many instances, more affluent communities. So we've heard this a lot. We also call for banning the boot because you limit mobility for people who need to have their vehicles to get to work so that they can pay what they owe. And so we just think that that is a draconian policy that is not helpful in any way. And there are more productive things that we can do to recoup whatever money is owed that don't limit mobility and that don't make life extremely hard for especially those who are really on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale.
Such as what are the other productive ways to recoup that money? Because you're going to lose a lot of revenue if you ban, especially if you ban the boot, if you change the nature of the flow of money into the city coffers by changing the ticketing structure. How do you replace those revenues?
Well, you might not actually lose as much revenue as we anticipated. So in those instances, a lot of times people are so overwhelmed with getting the boot off that they just don't pay anything at all. And then their car is taken, it's impounded, and then it's sold. And the city actually doesn't really recoup very much once they've gone through that entire process. So we just believe that it is much, people typically when they don't pay, it's because they don't have the money to pay, not because they have a vendetta against the city and don't want to pay. So what we're doing is we're creating an environment where it's much easier for them to pay their debt without sending them into a spiral of bankruptcy to where they're going to be harmed into the future. And so we've seen instances where banning the boot actually has not led to a significant decrease in revenue. If anything, it creates less draconian policies that are not going to push people out of the city because they simply can't keep up with getting the tickets, getting the fees and fines, and then getting onto these payment plans that in many instances are still out of reach for a lot of our residents.
So there's a lot of to some extent I think agreement among the candidates or the highest profile candidates on a lot of different issues in this campaign. What's an issue besides, I'm not sure if, I think other candidates have talked about rethinking the parking revenues and being less draconian, but what's a policy or an issue that you've taken a stand on that's put you outside the box and makes you different from any of the other candidates that's significant?
Yeah, there are a couple. So one is that I have been working on this issue of having a public bank for the city of Chicago. I've been working on this nationally. It's happening in many cities and states across the country. I think that if we're going to create the economy for the future where the city is solvent, is able to generate revenue, is able to fund our own infrastructure, that we cannot continue a system where so much of our dollars are going to private financial institutions whose goal and allegiance is always to profit. We have to be able to do these things on our own. We have to be able to recirculate these dollars back into our economy. We have to be able to invest in economic growth, which means we can do things like issuing loans, just loans for businesses, home loans for homeowners, funding our own infrastructure. Those are things that a municipality should be able to do, and we can avoid the hundreds of millions of dollars that we pay to private financial institutions, the bad bank deals called toxic swaps that we were engaged in for so many years that have cost us money. Any city that is looking to be financially solvent into the future has to consider that, and that's something that's been unique on my platform. The other thing that's unique is, so there are actually two other things. One is with regard to education, that I call for CPS changing the student-based budgeting funding formula to an equity-weighted funding formula. Right now, the current funding formula, it essentially, the money follows the student, but it penalizes schools who've experienced population loss. Because the lower your population, the less funding you receive. Now that school cannot hire quality teachers and extracurricular activities, et cetera. With an equity-weighted funding formula, every student gets the dollars that they need, and that takes into account, exactly, takes into account their economic background, their household income, those sorts of characteristics, and it follows the student. So every student is getting what they need regardless of the building that they're in. So CPS has to fundamentally change its formula if we want to create an equitable education system across the board.
And would that take state legislation to do that?
It would not take state legislation. At the state level, though, it's about making sure that we're getting what we're owed from the state. And the new funding formula that they just enacted will help. But again, we have a system where schools are penalized for a lower population. And in Chicago, we've lost hundreds of thousands of residents. And in those communities, they're going to have a lower population. So the schools themselves shouldn't be penalized for that. So it's something that we have to look at.
And so how would the mayor enact that? Would that be something that would go through the CPS board?
Definitely.
And you are for elected school board?
Yes.
100% elected?
Yes. Yes.
And, okay, and you were going to mention another out-the-box policy.
Yeah, so I have really been pushing for diversifying our economic ecosystem. So I've done a lot of work in the cooperative economic model space. So these are worker-owned cooperatives. They're businesses where the employees are actually the owners. When we talk about building wealth in our communities, expanding revenue for the city, and building generational wealth, we have to create more pathways to ownership. And so worker-owned cooperatives are businesses where the employees actually determine their salary, they determine paid sick leave, all of the characteristics of their employment, and there's less turnover, they get to keep more of their profits, and there's much more stability. So these are models of ownership that we can be pushing. They're already starting to do this in many neighborhoods. We've got a barbershop that's cooperatively owned in Inglewood. We've got a grocery store that's cooperatively owned in Logan Square. And so part of our economy of the future is diversifying the economic ecosystem with worker-owned cooperatives, with housing cooperatives. I also talk about community land trusts, because in communities that are struggling to have affordable housing, or where we're trying to maintain affordability, in urban planning, the first question is who owns the land? And if you don't own the land, you don't have site control, you don't have a voice necessarily in what happens on that land. So these are innovative economic models that the city should be investing in so that the economy of the future is much more robust than the one that we have today.
You're talking a lot about economic development. These are really innovative approaches. A much bigger scale economic development plan that's been out there in the air for several years is Amazon. And it was just announced today that New York is pulling out of, that Amazon is pulling out of New York.
Yes.
And the mayor and the governor are all over it, and they're saying, look, give Chicago another look. What's your view on that? And as mayor, will you be begging Amazon to come in?
Definitely not begging. I mean, I think that, the question is, first of all, we need to look at why Amazon is pulling out of New York, because I think that would be instructive as to what they were offering and what ended up happening. With Amazon, Chicago has to lead on our values. And the fact that when we were first luring Amazon or trying to attract them, we did not advocate for a $15 an hour minimum wage was problematic to me, because these are the things that you can establish out front in the initial phase to say we're a city that believes in $15 an hour minimum wage as a company coming in.
You were saying we should have demanded that
There are many
Amazon
things, yes.
Promise that for their own workers.
Yes, that and other things that we can commit to, the kinds of jobs that are created, not just the ones that people will be driving in from the suburbs, but what are the ones that will be created in-house? Do we have a linked development option where we're building the location on this site, but then we have a secondary location, say on the west side or on the south side in an area where they could maximize that economic investment? That's the sort of creative thinking that can maximize what an Amazon would be for Chicago, not just giving them a $1.2 billion incentive package with very little accountability and hoping for the best. We've done that. We've seen how it works or doesn't work. And if we need examples, we can look at what's happened in Seattle and see how it impacted their economy and try to do better when we're attracting them here.
Now, you mentioned that there are other ways to bring in revenues other than booting everybody. So what is your revenue plan? I think you're against casinos, is that correct? What about marijuana, revenue from marijuana? You're against that as well?
No,
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
I'm fine with.
You're fine with marijuana?
I am. I'm fine with it. I think that it is a key economic sector that we need to maximize, not just from a consumer standpoint, but building pathways to ownership. And also, there's a multi-billion-dollar hemp industry that we don't really talk about as much, that I think as a city, we can actually be cultivating individuals and businesses that can take advantage of that hemp industry within the marijuana industry as a whole. So there are ways to build sort of on-ramps into that sector that I think as we move into the future, we should definitely do. I think with casinos, by the time all of the actors that want their hand in the pot get it, I just don't think that the revenue will be sufficient to warrant having a casino. Also, I think that it could be potentially harmful for our current hospitality and entertainment sectors because of the suck away from local venues, whether they're arts venues or entertainment venues, from a casino. I do, however, support video gaming in small businesses because it tends to help the business's bottom line. It just ups their profit margin. And for many small businesses, this is the additional revenue that can help them with expansions or hiring additional employees or other things that can enhance the quality of their business. And we know that if they are doing well, they are paying taxes, and that's additional revenue for the city. So there are some revenue strategies that I think can be effective in the long term. I just don't think that a casino is one of them. And then there are others that are more dubious, like a commuter tax. I don't think makes practical sense at this time either.
So where's the big money going to come from? Other than the hemp industry, that's something maybe could be explored, but that's going to take a while. We have some really immediate needs. What about taxes? Property taxes, sin taxes, where do you stand on that?
Well, I think sin taxes have always been regressive. I think the soda tax is an example, in my view, is an example of a sin tax. The cigarette tax is an example of a sin tax. I think those tend to be regressive. They tend to hit populations, especially lower income populations, harder. I really think that the city has to restructure how we collect property taxes to begin with and consider the sales tax revenue that we do not garner from your Amazons and other companies that are not your typical brick and mortar. This is the way the global economy is going. It's not just brick and mortar companies, it's more of these warehousing companies that sell through online sales. And we're not recouping the kind of revenue that we could be because we haven't upgraded or updated how we tax our property tax system to take into account the realities of the economy. That could be a significant source of revenue for the city. Also, there are immediate things that we don't do, such as the under-assessment of large real estate in the downtown area. The city doesn't aggressively go after those under-assessed properties, and they should, and they could, but they haven't been doing that.
What's your evidence that the properties downtown are under-assessed and that we're leaving money on the table? What's the evidence for that?
Yeah, so this came out when we were assessing the overall property tax system in Cook County, which was found to be very problematic, where lower income communities are overassessed and these large real estate holders are underassessed significantly. I experienced this firsthand when I used to work with seniors in Austin who were on the verge of losing their homes, and they couldn't understand why the assessment on their homes was so high. And then when we looked at large real estate holders downtown, they were able to hire high-priced property tax lawyers to file
like
appeals.
Ed Burke, like Mike Madigan.
Exactly. Yes. And they determined the legislation around this, so they're benefiting from that system, whereas lower income communities have actually been harmed. And the city just hasn't had a habit of aggressively going after those large real estate holders. And it's something that they could do if there was the political will to do it. And that's a shorter term thing that we could start doing next week.
Mm-hmm. What about property taxes?
So property taxes, I think,
in terms of raising property taxes, I mean, Bill Daley has called for a freeze on property taxes.
Yes, I mean, I think before we, the residents of Chicago, we hiked up property taxes by $500 million a few years ago, and then another $250 million. I just think that until we address issues of affordability, meaning how are we creating a city that is affordable, how are we addressing the economy so that people can actually make the kind of money that they need to stay in their communities, to stay in their homes. So the affordability is not just on the housing, it's also the jobs that are or are not available in the economy. And the city has not done a good job of that, which is why we're seeing people leaving the city, many when the property tax increase occurred. And I think if we rely just on increasing property taxes, we're simply going to push more of our residents out of the city. So we've got to have a comprehensive revenue strategy and actually address the fact that household income has been stagnant, that the jobs that were created were largely people commuting from the suburbs into the city. They weren't going to people who live in the neighborhoods. It's why when we talk about Amazon, I said we should lead on the $15 an hour minimum wage issue, because we know that increasing household income was one of the factors that will allow people to stay in the city. And if we're not making that ask, or at least putting it on the table for these large entities that are hiring, then we can't expect to increase household incomes across the board.
Let's shift a little bit and talk about some of your supporters.
Sure.
For example, Chance the Rapper.
Yes.
You said, I remember you said that Chance kind of called you out of the blue and said he was interested in your campaign. Were you a Chance fan? Were you listening to his music before that? I know you are now, right?
Of course. Of course. So I was a fan. Now, I wasn't totally into, I'm on the older end of the millennial scale. I didn't even know I was a millennial until like last year. But there was a song that he did, I think it was a couple of years ago, called Angels. And I remember because the video, he was sitting on top of the L train, and he was literally riding around the city on top of the L train. I thought it was just the coolest thing. So I was a fan of his from afar. And then our paths had crossed, but we never met formally in organizing spaces. So I was doing work with National Teachers Academy when CPS was trying to close them down. And he was also interested in that and supporting the parents and families of NTA. I've been supportive of the Coalition of Young People for No Cop Academy, and he's also been supportive. And we were at the same city council meeting, but our paths didn't
meet.
Exactly. So it wasn't until he reached out and said, hey, he's been following my work, that was the first time we actually formally met.
And some people say that put you on the map. That original donation was a $400,000?
That was a little bit later, his donation.
Well, the endorsement came in a big donation.
Certainly.
And that really raised your profile.
It did.
Gave you a lot of free media. Do you feel sometimes overshadowed by Chance?
I mean, I think it's fine. Like it definitely allowed us to reach groups because we've always been about expanding the electorate and expanding the base to bring more people into the process. And I think what he does is he gets many more people who otherwise wouldn't be paying attention to a mayoral campaign in Chicago into the process, which is very helpful for us. Whatever it takes to get people paying attention and to say, I'm going to participate in this election, I think we're like, fine, if that's him, more power to you. He has his lane, which I think is awesome. The arts community is very strong in Chicago, and so he comes with also these peers that are in hip hop, they're in R&B, they're dancers, they do spoken word and open mic nights, and it's a whole culture that he is a part of that I think we've been able to successfully bring into our campaign and actually get people thinking about voting in a mayoral election.
He's done some public appearances with you, some Get Out the Vote type activities.
Yes.
I keep waiting for a concert. Is there going to be a concert rally type thing before the election?
So we're thinking about closer to Election Day and what we can do to get out the vote. We did, a week ago, we actually did a large phone banking. We had a few hundred people together over in the Grand Ballroom on the South Side.
That was with Dorothy Brown.
Yes. People on the phones calling voters. And then we did a day party that became a night party. But it was a day party on Sunday, this past Sunday, and that was hundreds of people. Really good time.
And became a night party because it just kept going?
It kept going. I was like, oh, I guess this is going to go.
How late did it go?
So I left probably around, it might have been around 10 or 11, and it was still going strong. But, you know, these days I'm not that cool. Gotta sleep sometimes, right? Yeah. So you're thinking about some kind of a concert, or we definitely want to do something around Get Out the Vote on Election Day. So
Election Day.
Yeah. So we did some things on what we did last week and this past Sunday was in the lead up to early voting, which started on Monday, and so we're going to carry on with our strategy over the next couple of weeks, and then on Election Day we want to make sure that we're getting people to the polls and just figuring out ways to physically get people to the polls and reward them for voting and showing our appreciation for their support.
Another famous supporter is Kanye West.
Yes.
Who, yes, she says, who comes with a little bit of controversy, partly because he came in at a time when you had some fines that were due to the Illinois State Board of Elections from your previous campaign, and he wrote a check to take care of that for you. Partly because he's been a supporter in the past for Donald Trump. So. How's Kanye West helped you other than that $74,000 check he wrote for you?
Well, I think the thing about Kanye West is when we initially started talking, when he reached out, it was also out of the blue, which, you know.
And was that through chance, or was
it was? So he had been talking about coming back to Chicago in general, and that he wanted to move back to the area. He was really looking to invest in the economy. He was wanting to bring his companies. He has his Yeezy company, production company, manufacturing to Chicago. So he was really thinking about how he can give back to the city and how he can come back to the city. And so he said that whenever he was having these conversations, my name kept coming up. So that's when he just reached out to me. And our initial conversations were actually not necessarily about him even supporting my mayoral campaign. It was really, what does it look like to expand economic opportunity for people in Chicago? How do I use my companies to hire people? What does that look like? So it was more visioning about how this native son of Chicago, who's from the South Side, grew up here, can actually give back to the city that raised him. As we talked, he stated that he really believed that this was the campaign that was necessary for Chicago and has the ideas for the city's future. We did talk about his views in our initial conversation. Of course, I asked. I mean, it was going to be the elephant in the room.
Trump, right.
Yes, and so he made clear in those initial conversations we had, we talked about his stance on immigration, on mental health, on just things that were happening nationally, and he said that he does not support Trump's policies, but he wants people to be able to engage with those who think differently without becoming a pariah. So the ability to disagree with someone, but that doesn't mean that we can't communicate.
But it extends to wearing a Make America Great hat and being in the Oval Office and doing a lot of backslapping?
Yeah, well, you know, I think he really believed that if you have the opportunity to engage with the president, that you take that opportunity. I do know that when he did go, there were conversations around criminal justice reform and mental health services in Chicago that were taken. This was around the time when the Attorney General was trying to revamp stop and frisk. And so some of the talking points that he took with him into the Oval Office were related to stop and frisk, were related to criminal justice reform, and were related to mental health services, of course, because he's someone who has been in need of mental health services throughout at least later on in his career. So there are some tangible things that he does feel strongly about that if presented with the opportunity to make a case or to advocate for some things, that he would be able to do so.
And has he done anything else since he wrote that check? Has he been involved or made any appearances for you or anything else since then?
Yeah, no, he's been busy with other projects. I mean, every now and then he'll check in when we made it on the ballot, when we turned in our signatures, then when we made it on the ballot, he checked in. So he's been following it for sure. But he's been sort of good job, things are going well type supporter.
From afar, which might be a good thing. Dorothy Brown recently endorsed you after she herself did not get on the ballot. Some people have questioned that because she's been under federal, never been indicted or charged with anything, but been under federal investigation for a long time. Yes. Some folks in her office have been convicted. So where did you have that conversation too with Dorothy Brown?
Of course.
And are you comfortable with that endorsement with that?
Yes.
Context?
Yes, we definitely had that conversation. I mean, my thing is you have to confront these things head on. You can't, we're not going to shy away from it or pretend that these things aren't in the background. We have to confront it head on and have an honest conversation about what it looks like if we're going to move forward. And so we did talk about it, and I did affirm that the investigation, no matter how long it goes, it has to go through to its end, that there's no shying away from the fact that it is going on. I don't know what the outcome is going to be, but whatever the outcome, we believe in the rule of law, we believe in following the law, and whatever the outcome is, she will face it. For good or bad. I'm not sure. It's been going on for a number of years.
Several years.
It's been a long time. So with that understanding, we knew that we have to be able to to answer that question and to affirm that this is where we are, that we're not going to downplay or minimize or try to walk away from what that is. But what we can do...
What does that mean, though? I mean, when you say walk away from what that is, meaning...
Well, to say, oh, well, she's not under... to just try to downplay that the investigation is ongoing. It's there, right? And you've got to own it.
Okay.
And so I feel very strongly in just owning it.
And you're owning that by supporting her, I mean, by accepting her support, right?
Yes, and by accepting her support and saying that this is a thing that had to be discussed, that has to be confronted, that we have to be able to speak on. But also what we have to speak on is the fact that she is someone who's always been independent. Our campaign has always talked about being independent, not being tied to the machine. She's someone who beat the machine a number of times, someone who's always been sort of an outsider, if you will, as it relates to Democratic politics in Chicago, someone who's always been more of an independent voice. And so there was alignment there with our desire to draw that distinction between the establishment or machine candidates and someone who's been an outsider. She also brings a very strong base of supporters from around the city, not just in the county level, but definitely in the city, with older voters, with black voters, with the
church-going folks.
Exactly, church folks, who we also want to bring into our tent, because in this kind of election with 14 candidates, it's all about coalition building. It's all about getting as many possible voters as you can.
Now, I have to ask you about the controversies that have come up more recently in your campaign and around. Now, this is the debt you owe to the state in terms of the Board of Elections. That goes back a ways, but more recently you had some problems with the IRS not completely reporting your income. There have been some questions about whether or not you've been paying your bills on time, and there's also the most recent one, I think, is about whether or not you misrepresented your status as a runner. You left the impression that you were an Iron. I don't understand this stuff because I'm not a runner, but there's some technical aspects to being an Ironman versus not being an Ironman. So respond to those. These are the kinds of things that candidates have to deal with.
Yes.
They dig into your background. That opposition research can be deep.
Yes, very much so. So on the IRS issue, if you ever have a mistake or whatever on your taxes, you have to file an amendment. When you discover whatever the issue is, you have to file an amendment. So it's not an uncommon thing. That's what happened in my case. We already had addressed it and we're going through the process. So it wasn't actually anything that was new or that came up all of a sudden. So it was just saying we're already going through the process. We already identified where the mistake was. We were working with...
So you made a mistake in terms of how you underestimated your income. It was $21,000 you
Yes. So when you're independent, you have many different documents that you have to file based upon where your income is coming from. And so there was a set of documents from when I worked on the Kennedy campaign that didn't make it into the document dump that I did with my accountant. So once that was discovered, you go through the process, you have to file an amendment, and then you move forward. And whatever the IRS determines you have to pay, then you pay whatever it's owed.
And have you made the IRS whole? Are you out of the woods with them?
Yeah, so so the option is you can pay in a lump sum or you can do a payment plan. And so for me, the payment plan is much more reasonable. So you just go through the process. It's just one of those things where you identify it, you address it, you move forward. I think the other issue that was referenced was around student loans, and anyone who's gone to college, unless someone has had the blessing of having their entire college paid for, has student loan debt. I worked in the public sector for worked almost entirely in the public sector, I chose to do community work, and that just means it's a less lucrative career path. I went through from undergrad all the way to a PhD, so I have student loans, and they need to be paid. I think that is an experience that most students actually understand, when we talk about why the economy of the future is so crucial, it's because 1 in 3 millennials don't even see a future in Chicago, and that's very troubling. If we can't afford to live here because they have student loans, well, that's a big issue. And again, that's another opportunity for me to use my experience and my background to lift up the voices of those who may be going through something similar. So I think that was pretty much it. On the running piece, I was so confused. So apparently it was a branding thing between there's an official brand of Ironman that's just for Ironman, whereas the race itself or the distance, I guess, there's an official brand and it can only be that brand. Now I had, for the race that I did, had always called it the Ironman 7.3. That's what it was in my mind. But apparently it wasn't.
Branded by
exactly,
the official brand.
Exactly. But it didn't mean that the race didn't happen. I mean, it was just, I was confused. I didn't even realize this until I had to go back to the original website and double check. And I was like, who's even thinking about that? I'm not a professional. I participate, but I'm not a professional that thinks about it that deeply. So it was interesting to see that these are the things, as we're talking about the city on the brink of financial distress, we're talking about the number of shootings in Chicago, we're talking about education, and folks are talking about the marathons and triathlons that I've done. It just seemed interesting, to say the least.
I think the financial stuff raises questions among some folks. You know, you just talked about the city's on the brink of financial disaster, multi-billion-dollar budget. If you're having personal problems or challenges with your own personal finances, does that raise questions about you managing a multi-billion-dollar city budget?
Yeah, I certainly don't think that it does, in particular because managing a city's finances is not the same as managing your personal finances. You actually have an entire finance department, you have staff, you have experts who do that. Also, we've had mayors who've had stellar personal finances and who come from immense wealth who brought us to the point where our city is on the brink of financial ruin. And
who would that be?
Our previous mayor, whose strategy was simply to borrow.
You're talking about Daley or
both? So Daley and Rahm, who Daley for 20-something years and Rahm just for the last 8 years. But they've both had great personal finances, and that hasn't translated into a city that is fiscally on solid ground. Through another lens, we had perhaps our greatest mayor, Harold Washington, who actually went to jail for some tax issues that he had, and that didn't prevent him from being one of the greatest, if not the greatest mayor that this city has had. So I think drawing that line to say that how you handle your personal finances or any issues that someone experiences would prevent them from being able to lead the city effectively is not, it's just not a clear line to draw. But it's also the point that people who live in lower income communities often get that same treatment. They're told, or the message is that because they aren't wealthy and don't have the money to buy their way into political clout or access, that we don't pay attention, that we overlook them, in the same way that we will disqualify an individual who doesn't come from a lot of wealth from being in leadership in this city. So I think that there's a direct parallel between how we marginalize people who come from lower income communities because they don't have wealth, and how we marginalize individuals who want to be in leadership because they don't have wealth.
So wealth equals credibility, and people who have wealth get a pass in a way.
I think they do. I mean, our president, I think, is an example of that.
Well, that seems like a good place to pause and open it up to you guys. Yes. We have a mic, so hold on for the mic just to make sure we get recorded.
Dr. Enyia, thank you for being here. It's been exciting to hear you speak. I want to bring the question back to property taxes. So it's been my assessment that candidates like Bill Daley will go out and say, presumably to appeal to wealthier Chicago voters who own property, saying, no, we're not going to raise your property taxes or we're going to freeze them. What do you say to those voters? Perhaps a nuanced way of saying, you know, we're not going to go for the easy thing, which might be to, you know, freeze property taxes. In fact, we're going to take a better look at them and realize that saving the city is more than just, you know, looking at property taxes. There's all these other things. Yeah, I'd just love to hear you expound more and unpack what your ideas are for addressing this question of, you know, no, we're not going to raise property taxes. Yes, we're going to, you know, I think freezing them presumes we're not going to increase them, but that could also mean, like, no, we're going to lower them. I don't know. Could you tell us more?
It's interesting to clarify. His position has been I'm going to freeze them, but if I decide we do have to raise them, I'm going to find the equivalent cuts to the amount I raised. So he's already kind of backing off of that a little bit, right?
Yeah, he certainly is. And so the case to make to those who would be more resistant or who would be more amenable to freezing property taxes, what people are looking for is they want to see that government is serious about addressing not just where we identify revenue, but the waste that we've also had. So the fact that we're paying $1.7 billion just in police misconduct cases, that is money that could otherwise be used to invest in education, invest in economic development across the board, yet we're paying that cost because we refuse to implement the necessary reforms that communities have been calling for years. We also haven't addressed the waste from corruption. So no bid contracts that have gotten, in CPS we saw our previous CEO who is now going to prison for a $20 million no bid contract scandal, right? So imagine the scale of that happening in the city's corporate fund and where that waste is occurring. So people want to know that government is serious about addressing the waste and mismanagement of existing tax dollars before they are going to be receptive to increasing their property taxes. The other thing that we have to consider is when we talk about a property tax increase, we have to look at exemptions, we have to look at carve-outs for those who are on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. I know that there are proposals to increase the property tax on properties of $1 million and up. So it's designed to get more from those who have a higher ability to pay. So that kind of nuance, I think, is where the conversation should take place. But we have to be committed to addressing the waste and corruption that also costs us significantly, in addition to identifying revenue.
Let's go on this side. Yes.
Hello. Excuse me. Hi, thank you. My question would be about police accountability in Chicago, kind of on two ends, I think, and I would appreciate if you can confirm your support of banning the Chicago gang database that marginalizes communities based off of basically BS information, as well as your thoughts on kind of with the consent decree, if, again, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure was accepted by the Attorney General of Illinois, and how you would move forward with that as mayor.
So I have been part of the calls for ending the gang database just because of the things that you stated, the lack of transparency about how you get on the database, the fact that it could also lead to deportations, the fact that you don't know how you can get off of it. 20 years later, perhaps, you might find that you were in this database. And so there are many problematic things with it. And so I think that as we look at the impact of having that contact with the criminal justice system, it's just another way that sort of pipelines people into the criminal justice system, which is problematic. On the consent decree, the city had demonstrated that it was necessary to have another layer of oversight. We're paying that cost financially and morally, quite honestly. And so I think that it had to move forward, even though it's not it's not perfect by any stretch. It doesn't solve all of the issues that we have. I think importantly, we've got to think about the Fraternal Order of Police contract and having a mayor that can advocate strongly in the best interest of Chicagoans with the police union. And that means addressing things like the disciplinary records of officers. People want to know beyond 5 years whether or not an officer has had a significant disciplinary problem, right? They don't want the idea that officers have the 24 hours of time to essentially put their story together is problematic and scary, and we saw the example of that with the 3 officers that were just acquitted in the Laquan McDonald case, where they clearly had conspired and yet they were all acquitted. They had time to craft a narrative that actually was not the truth. And so those things are very concerning, and they have to be discussed by the mayor with the police union to make sure that the necessary reforms are put in place, because the legitimacy of the department is what will create an environment where there's trust between the community and police. And good faith efforts to enact those reforms can help to build the legitimacy necessary to send a message to the community that the police department is actually wanting to work with us and not just to be combative with us.
We have somebody over here? Yes.
Sorry.
As a relative newcomer to running for office, I was interested in your stance on campaign finance and whether you would consider signing Common Cause Illinois' pledge on public voluntary financing.
So I love Common Cause and their pledge. I have folks that I've worked with that have been part of Common Cause. I mean, campaign finance reform is in an election where we just had the richest man in Illinois donating $1 million to a candidate. The disparity in terms of who can participate and who can't because of the way campaign finance laws are structured. I mean, it's a significant obstacle. Our support, we've got small dollar support, but the reality is it takes a lot of money to run a campaign in Chicago for mayor. And if you cannot self-finance, then that's a significant obstacle. I mean, even in the gubernatorial race, we spent close to $200 million, one of the most expensive races in the country. And we had candidates who could self-finance. They could write $7 million checks to their campaigns every quarter. And that's a significant obstacle to regular people who, again, also deserve to have their voices heard, but also deserve to be able to run for office. And again, this is where the messaging around who gets to run is so crucial, because if you can't run because the financial obstacles are too high, or you don't have a multimillionaire backing you, then it almost becomes impossible to participate in the electoral process, not just as a voter, but as a candidate. And so I think campaign finance reform is such a huge thing that we've got to, I mean, as a country. And we have Citizens United at the Supreme Court level that has made it so much more difficult to have the kind of campaign finance laws that would be beneficial. But it's something that I'm in favor of. I always would support it. I think it opens up the democratic process to more people who don't get barred from it because they can't afford it.
Well, she's going to check with you after we finish talking
I'm
to get
sure.
you to sign that pledge.
Yes.
Over here, yes.
Thank you for being here. So I was wondering, as someone who's running a campaign for change and pretty much coming as a newcomer into the city council space, can you talk a little bit about ways that you can work with the city council and in order to roll out your platform? I think that you have a lot of great ideas, but I think coming in, I wouldn't say necessarily anti-establishment, but kind of as a counter option for that, I think, how would you work with them?
Well, the hope is that we'll get some changes in city council also in this election cycle, so we won't have the whole cast of characters that we have now. I firmly believe in establishing individual relationships with every member of city council. I think that you cannot work productively if your relationship is driven by perception or what you read about someone or what you think about that person. You actually have to get to know every individual of city council so that you can understand where is that area that we can agree on, where are the commonalities that we can build on. To me, that's responsible leadership, because it allows us to negotiate on the things that are important and still be productive, even if we're not aligned from top to bottom. I've had to work with individuals who I don't necessarily agree with on policy. I had a law that was passed that I initiated that Governor Rauner signed into law late last year, and that was a bipartisan effort.
What was that?
So it was for the small business community. It actually lifted a statewide law that made it harder for businesses to locate in commercial corridors where there are nonprofit organizations or churches in those corridors. So we had to change state law to make it easier so that we could attract more investment to some of our struggling commercial corridors. And it had to be a bipartisan effort. I had to work, both sides of the aisle, and Governor Rauner was the one who signed it into law. And so I think it's about being productive and building relationships with individuals that are based upon the things that we can agree on so that we can move the ball on things, which is, to me, that's responsible leadership. So anyone that's in city council, you have to find out what is important to them, because what is important to them is supposed to be important to their constituents. And your goal or your responsibility is to represent the people of Chicago and what's in their interest. And you cannot do that if you can't establish productive relationships with every member of city council.
Do you currently have relationships that you've already developed with city council members
Yes.
What percentage of the council, which is the sitting council, would you say that you know and you've worked with already?
Well, so I definitely have worked a lot with members of the Progressive Caucus over the years on different issues, different ordinances, et cetera. I've also worked with many members of the Black Caucus. I've drafted legislation. I do some data analysis for a couple of members of the Black Caucus. I've had to, in my work with the Chamber of Commerce and my economic development work, I've had to work with aldermen, most of the aldermen on the west side of Chicago, and also state reps, state senators, et cetera. So I've worked I worked on the legislation. We did the press conference in Tom Tunney's ward, and he's always been a big small business advocate as a business owner himself. So I've gotten a chance to work with a lot of these individuals in different aspects. And again, we don't necessarily all agree down the line. I mean, my West Side Alderman, Emma Mitz, is very strong on the police training academy, and I've been very vocal with standing with No Cop Academy, and we've sat in the same room and talked, and that's a clear difference, but it hasn't prevented us from being able to work on other things together.
Over here? Yes, in the back.
Hi. I'd like to return to the question on policing and accountability. Can you give us a little bit of an idea of your larger picture platform on policing and how that interacts with your community-first, people-centered platform? I know you mentioned No Cop Academy and civilian oversight. Do you have a plan for a larger shift of investment away from policing and training into communities and services, and how will that look under your leadership?
Yeah, so the crux of No Cop Academy is just that. It's saying that we need economic investment, we need the expansion of mental health resources in our communities, we need the expansion of education opportunities, and as opposed to the $95 million that we're spending on a police academy, we need to be investing those kinds of resources into the things that build strong individuals and strong communities. So that's the crux of the argument that supports the No Cop Academy's movement. I think when I talk about policing, we always invest in police infrastructure, which is why policing is over a third of our budget. Yet we still see the number of shootings, the number of homicides, and the things that are happening in our neighborhoods. We actually should be shifting that investment not only to the economy and to housing and all these other things, but also to restorative justice practice in neighborhoods and in schools. We could expand restorative justice practice in schools, which teaches things like conflict resolution, processing through trauma, those things that actually build productive people as opposed to expanding the number of police officers in schools. I also think that the city can build infrastructure to support strong block clubs, because the best eyes and ears on a block are the people who live on that block. And over the years, CPD has divested almost completely in community policing. Well, there's enough resources in the department, I think, to actually fund strong block club infrastructure, so that now we're empowering people to be the best eyes and ears on their blocks, so that they are well-resourced, and then they can work in partnership with the police if they have to, as opposed to having this flooding neighborhoods with police and people are not even empowered on their blocks. And we can scale up, so we can focus on perhaps the 10 communities experiencing the highest levels of violence, build and invest in that strong block club infrastructure, and then scale it up from there to other communities. But that's an initiative that the police department would have to have, and they'd have to shift some of their resources to doing that. We haven't seen that. In fact, they've gone the opposite way. So again, that is about being people-centered. It's about valuing people where they are and empowering people so that they can maximize, they can live up to their fullest potential. And we can't do that if we're just investing in police infrastructure as a way to reduce violence.
Any more questions? If I have a couple quick ones before we close out. This has been fabulous. So we're very likely, given there's 14 folks in this race, to have a runoff. You have to get that 50% plus one, and it's going to be virtually mathematically impossible for any one candidate to do that. So who would you like to run with in the runoff?
Oh, man. I think that I would hope that he doesn't get into the runoff, but Bill Daley, because I think that he, and this is not just him in terms of his personality, but I think in terms of the policies that he's proposing, harken back to the Daley era in Chicago, when this is a time where we need to be moving forward. And so there's such a clear distinction between what he wants the city to be and how he would get there, and what we want the city to be and how we would get there. And so I think it would present a very clear picture to Chicagoans that, you know, we can either go backwards or we can go forward.
And how would you describe the clear difference between how he would run the city and get there and you would run it and get there?
Yes, I mean, just the policies they're problematic in a number of ways. So, you know, this idea of consolidating CPS and city colleges, which does absolutely nothing to address the issues within each individual institution, and is simply a consolidation which in the past has been used to save money, but it's resulted in lower quality services and the perpetuation of the problems within those institutions. So just not very well thought out. There's also this idea of consolidating or reducing the number of aldermen, which has been bandied about for a while, but you can have 15 corrupt aldermen. If you don't actually address the function of the aldermen and mitigate corruption by how they function, then even if you scale down to 15, you could still have 15 corrupt aldermen. So it's just not very well thought out. He wants to amend the Constitution to essentially to cut pension benefits. And I just think if we haven't had a serious conversation about addressing the waste and corruption that we've been experiencing, as well as a comprehensive revenue generating strategy for the city with the ideas that will move us forward, then we shouldn't necessarily be talking about cutting pension benefits. It just won't be a productive conversation. So those are the sorts of things that I think, you know, he wants to do. And you know, we've tried that. We've tried 20 some odd years of that, and it's led us to this point where we are. So perpetuating that doesn't give me any confidence that the city would do any better with him in any kind of leadership position.
Daley versus Enyia. Enyia versus Daley.
I mean,
that'd be a whopper of a race.
Yes, indeed.
My last question is, if you get into the runoff, we're going to have another program in March for the two folks in the runoff around policing, public safety, obviously issues you care a lot about on March 13th. So if you're in the runoff, will you come back and do that forum with us?
Of course.
With Daley or whoever else it is?
Yes, yes, indeed, I would.
Thank you very much. Looking forward.